Hello. This is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks so much for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we are going over the biggest mixing mistakes you can make in today's live stream podcast episode. And it is very specifically about vocal mixing mistakes this time. Because I got to tell you, vocal is one of the main things that so many beginner and intermediate music producers, audio engineers get wrong when they are mixing. It's one of the harder things to get right on a lot of productions. That's especially true in modern productions. If you're working with electronic music and lots of samples and the like, or if you're working in hip hop, or if you're working in contemporary rock production, so often you won't have too much trouble getting really impressive sounds out of synths and drum machines and maybe guitar amp simulators, but the vocals just don't seem to hold up. And the huge mistakes that we're going to look at today come up again and again when I'm either mastering or doing coaching work for my more beginning and intermediate clients. It's stuff I see constantly, and they really make mixes sound amateurish, number one. Number two, they suck confidence away from the sound of the singer and just make the singer less compelling. And these mistakes act as this kind of roadblock that stops us from emotionally connecting to the music, which is a really big thing. So if you want your mixes to sound more impressive and you want your music to be more likely to actually resonate and strike a chord with a listener, you'll definitely get a lot out of today's episode. Who am I? Why should you be listening to me about this? Well, my name is Justin Colletti. I'm a mastering engineer with gold and platinum credits. I think some of the relevant credit websites have me as one of the top 1 or 2% of mastering engineers in the entire world. That sounds really impressive until you realize that some of my favorite mastering engineers are in the top 0.1%. But it's not too bad for a guy who spends only part of his time mastering and a lot of the other time creating courses and coaching people and teaching other people how to do audio engineering and music production. So for someone who does both of those things, it's not too shabby. But even more importantly than having gold and platinum credits is I get to listen to not just high-level work, great artists, great producers, but I get to listen to the work of so many beginners, so many people intermediate, just breaking through to pro, and finding out what sets them apart from the true professionals and the true masters of the craft. And here's the good news. These 5 major mistakes I'm going to tell you about today are actually super easy to fix. You're going to be shocked at how easy it is to make your vocal sound much better. Let's get right into it. Only the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. The biggest sponsor, as always, is you. How do you sponsor this podcast? If you like what you hear in today's episode, we go deep. But if you want to go even deeper, check out some of our great flowing courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs. They will change the way that you work forever for the better, guaranteed your money back. Also, big shout out and thanks to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Without further ado, let's get right into it. And the number one most common vocal mixing mistake I hear is not enough compression. We're going to get out of the way right up front. Now, it's really interesting. There's actually a video that I saw recently making its way around the web with Billie Eilish's engineer, where he talks about how he doesn't use compression. There's this modern style of production he's doing where he actually doesn't use vocal compression. And in a way that's true, but in a way it's actually extremely misleading because he's doing way more than compression and he's actually using extremely extreme types of compression. And chances are 9 times out of 10, you're probably not using enough compression on your vocals if you're just starting out. Most beginners are not making the mistake of over-compressing their vocals and I go, you're compressing way too much. No. We get hammered into our heads again and again when we're learning music production that you should never compress by more than 3 dB, never EQ by more than 3 dB, and I'm here to tell you nonsense. Almost all of your favorite records, if they are major commercial releases, have 10 or 20 dB or more cumulative compression on vocals, and chances are that you are not doing enough. This is doubly true if you're working in electronic music genres, modern rock genres, hip-hop genres, where there are so many elements that are so well dynamically controlled. If you're making music with drum machines and soft synthesizers or hardware synthesizers, these are extremely dynamically well-controlled material, and now you're taking this extremely erratic and dynamically uncontrolled vocal and trying to make it sit with those, and it doesn't. The same thing happens with hip hop, where you're using tons of samples that are extremely dynamically consistent and your vocal isn't. Or you're making rock records and maybe you're using some guitar amps or amp simulators. Maybe you're doing some sample augmentation on drums or parallel bus compression on drums. And everything is solidly well dynamically controlled except for your vocals that you're not doing nearly enough compression on. And there's also very specific ideas about what kinds of compression that you should be using that we're going to be talking about more and more as we go along. So that's big thing number one. If you are not getting cumulative across, say, your main vocal track, a vocal bus, and then maybe a mix bus, 10 to 20 dB of compression, chances are it's not enough for most modern styles of music. And no, when you do this, vocals do not sound overprocessed. They actually often end up sounding more raw and more emotionally resonant, particularly if you take really heavily compressed vocals and you don't put a lot of reverb or delay on them. They really come right up front to the listener. They feel more intimate, more gritty, more like you're standing right next to your actual favorite singer. That's what lots of compression and dynamic range control sounds like when done properly on a good vocal. And if you're lacking the intimacy and the rawness, you're possibly underprocessing rather than overprocessing. Now, I'll give you a quick counterexample here because, there's a grain of truth in every piece of bad advice. So the bad advice of only compress by 3 dB can make sense if you're recording. If you're tracking, that's not a bad idea. It's also not a bad idea in certain subgenres and certain styles of, say, really organic sounding, almost retro-ish folk or jazz records, but even like a lot of really contemporary jazz and folk records have a lot of compression on vocals. If you're doing an opera recording, you probably don't want a lot of compression on vocals. Classical music is some of the most uncompressed music out there, even through today, even though there's more and more compression on jazz and folk and other acoustic styles today. And also I want to talk really quickly about this Billie Eilish engineer who said, I don't compress vocals. Yeah, you know what he does instead? He goes in and uses like clip gain, basically pre-volume writing everything at the waveform level so that's extremely dynamically consistent. And then after he's made it extremely dynamically consistent by hand, basically compressing the vocal, bringing up the quiet parts and bringing down the loud parts until they're uniform, then he uses, instead of compression, limiting. And what is limiting? Limiting is really heavy, hard compression with a really, really high ratio and a really, really fast tack. It's basically the most intense kind of compression you can do, and that's what he's doing to his vocals. So yes, the Billie Eilish engineer who had this video that's been viewed like 1 million times, I don't use compression. No, he uses even harder than compression. He goes in there, micromanages the waveforms by hand, and then uses a super fast, super high ratio, super intense compressor called the limiter. So in a way, he's telling the truth. He doesn't use compression. In reality, he's using way more compression in effect than you are. And it's not just the compression. It's also the type and style of compression, which brings us to mistake number 2, which is when you are doing compression, you're starting to do enough compression on the vocals, really in any genre, that you're using the wrong attack time. And that generally means attacks that are too slow, that let too much transient through, that exaggerate the fricatives of your audio, of your singer's vocal. What's a fricative? We're talking about the initial consonant sounds. Not only sibilance, things like S's and T's, but also things like all of these, those kinds of sounds, the fricative consonant sounds can start leaping out. Because a funny thing that compressors do, particularly when they have slow attack times, is that they actually have the effect of, to a degree, uncompressing your signal. What? Justin, compressors can uncompress my signal? Yes. Compressors, when they have a slow attack time that does not catch the initial transients, what it does is the compressor will bring down the sustain relative to the transient, which has the effect of making your transients leap out even more. And also the transients in any performance, if it's a real live performance, tend to be the most dynamically fluctuating part of the performance. So a vocal that's just compressed with slow attack compression can have transients that leap out too much, which gives you a less professional sound, because that's not what compression on major records sounds like. That's number one. Excuse me while I cough on this live stream. But number two is that you can actually get less dynamically controlled sounding vocals, because the most dynamic portion of the vocal gets uncompressed and actually leaps out even more relative to the sustaining portions, because your attack time is too slow to catch it. So remember when we think about this Billie Eilish engineer who said that he doesn't use compression, because instead he's riding things, both pre and post fader, to get them to be really dynamically consistent, what a compressor does. And then on top of that, he adds limiting. And what is limiting but a really, really instantly fast, really high ratio compressor? That kind of sound, a very fast attack compression, is the sound of compression on vocals on modern records. So what does this mean specifically when you're selecting attack times and specific types of compressors? Number one, it means leaning less on things like an LA2A. This is a very famous tube compressor with an attack of something like 10 milliseconds or more. It means leaning less on things like that and more on things like, say, an 1176, which is another type of old school compressor that has very, very fast attack times. If you are getting the majority of your compression out of something like an LA2A style compressor, and a minimal amount of your compression out of something like an 1176 style compressor, you're doing it exactly backwards for most modern styles of music production. Pop, rock, metal, hip hop, everything. So strike that, reverse it. If you're using hardware style compressors, get more out of the fast attack ones, like an 1176, get less out of the slower attack ones, like an LA2A. If you're using more modern style compressors, ones that have independent attack and release controls and you can dial everything in, get most of your vocal compression out of shorter attack times. What would those shorter attack times be? Let's say anywhere from 0 milliseconds to 5 milliseconds. The sound of a lot of compression on modern records is 0 milliseconds, 0.5 milliseconds, 1 millisecond, 2 milliseconds. And if that is making the vocal sound too dull and you're kind of smearing the fricatives too much and you're smearing the consonants too much, then you might back that off to 4 or 5 milliseconds. But there's another thing you can do. Remember I said you can uncompress using compressors, you can make transients leap out more. This is where your slower attack compressors come in. If you have something that you've really kind of brick-walled, shaved off the transients to a significant degree and made them really consistent and steady, but now you want to bring some attack and detail back to the front end of each word, now you want to think about adding in some slower attack compressor and just a little bit of it. And what is a slow attack? Well, in the context of vocals, I would say 10 milliseconds to 30 millisecond attack time. So you might be using two compressors, quite a bit of something that does more in the 0 to 4 or 5 milliseconds range. Think about a half millisecond, 1 millisecond, 2 milliseconds. And less of something that does more in that 10 milliseconds and up range. And that gives us the classic vocal compression stack of an 1176 plus an LA2A. Me personally, if you want some of my favorite vocal compressors, it really depends on genres. Sometimes I like an even vibier version of an LA2A, like the, what's it called? Is it the Acme Opticom that Plugin Alliance has as a plugin? That's a really fun LA2A sounding one, but like even more gritty. I really like that one. If you want like really smooth kind of opto compression, again, Plugin Alliance, they have the TwinCom. That's a, oh man, how am I forgetting the brand that makes that one? Someone type it into the comments or the chat if you remember who makes the TwinCom based on a piece of hardware. It's like I think it's a tube opto compressor, very clean. And then I love stuff like the Waves and Universal Audio have those blue and silver faced 1176s. I really love those. But you can use so many different things. It really is about faster attack compression for modern genres and a little bit of slower attack compression. Don't be afraid to do 10 dB or more on your faster one and 3 dB or more on your slower one. Not uncommon. So now that we've been talking about the right and wrong attack times, that leads us to our next big thing here, which is too much sibilance. This is the S's and the T's leaping out. And sometimes when people start to compress enough, they get too much sibilance. And part of the reason for this is that they're using too slow attack time compressors and the S's and T's jump out. And you get the vocals to a point where they're bright enough, and now it's just sibilant city, and it's like awkward and unprofessional sounding to listen to. So there's two factors. One is leaning in too hard into slower attack compression. But even if you are using faster attack compression, some of these S's and T's and stuff can still get through and be a little bit harsh when you're getting the vocal as bright as you really want it. So the biggest thing I find around too much sibilance is doing something that I used to do wrong, which is putting your de-esser in the wrong place on your vocal chain. Well, first of all, the biggest issue is not using a de-esser at all, which a lot of beginning and an unfortunate number of intermediate producers and engineers don't even put a de-esser on the chain, and they wonder why they have too much sibilance. Maybe they don't even recognize that they have too much sibilance. But the de-esser in the wrong place, I used to start by doing a de-esser at the beginning of my vocal chain. And I'm going to tell you right now that this is useless. Don't do it. You may as well not have it there. Because I'm going to explain something that's a little bit technical to you, but you're going to get it. When you put a de-esser at the beginning of your vocal chain, you are trying to compress or catch a very, very small transient. Let's say that the average level of your vocal sound is at negative 18 dB. You know what? Let's use let's say it's a negative 18 dB. And let's say your transients from the S's and T's are 6 dB above that. So they're at negative 12. So you have an average level, that's one level, and you have transients that are 6 dB above your average level. And then you try to de-ess those, and you're taking that 6 dB peak and you're bringing it down by 2 or 3 dB. So now it's only, 2 dB or 4 dB above the average instead of being 6 dB above the average. Great. I did a good job. I de-essed it. No, you did nothing, because what's happening after that is you're going to have 10 or 20 dB of compression happening afterwards that doesn't catch the S or the T. And when you do 10 or 20 dB of compression that does not catch the S or the T, guess what? Now your transients on the vocal are no longer 6 dB above the average. Now they are 16 to 26 dB above the average. And you think that having de-essed it by 2 or 3 dB is going to do anything? No. You've taken it down from being 16 to 26 dB above the average to now, great, it's only 13 to 23 dB above the average? No, those S's and T's are still leaping out at you. When you de-ess, you've got to put that sucker at the end of your vocal chain. It should be either the last or pretty much the last thing in your vocal chain. Maybe you can get away with boosting a little bit more high frequency after the de-esser, so it can be your second to last thing in the vocal chain. Or maybe you put your saturation after the de-esser, so it's a little bit more consistent and you don't have the, peaks that you're softening with the de-esser, triggering a saturator. So there's reasons that it might not be the very last thing in your chain. Maybe brightening EQ, maybe saturation goes to the very end after the de-esser, but the de-esser should be either the last thing in your chain or one of the very last things in your chain. Because to be effective, you might be having to do 6 or 12 dB of de-essing on a heavily compressed vocal for it to actually make a difference. And that's just not going to happen when you put it at the beginning of the chain. You've just wasted a slot in your processing. It basically may as well not even be there. So that's one of the ways to fix it. This moves us on to our next one, which is really common on the opposite end of the spectrum. Instead of having these excessively sibilant highs where you don't have too much 8K overall or 10K overall, but you just have way too much 8 or 10K on your S's and T's, the same kind of thing can happen at the bottom end of the spectrum with too much mud or boominess in the vocal. And one of the most common things for people not to be cutting appropriately is the range of somewhere from like 100 hertz to 300 hertz, depending on whether it's a male or female vocal. On a male vocal, this might be 100 to 200 hertz. On a female vocal, it might be 200 to 300 hertz. But this low, kind of chesty, boomy region, you're often going to have too much of that in a raw recorded vocal, especially on a cardioid mic when someone's singing right up against it. That might sound big and full and impressive, especially when it's all by itself, but it can be hard to make that kind of vocal sit into the mix. And one of the big things that you can do here is just compress your vocal enough, and some of that gets taken care of. Done. Just going back to number one on this list, the not enough compression one, you solve that, and you're solving some of your too much mud or boominess problem. Just innately by having lots of compression. Now, with that said, it is very often the case, especially on close mic'd singers on cardioid microphone, that you're going to want to make cuts, either bell cuts or shelving cuts, in that range, somewhere 100 to 300 hertz. And really listen to your favorite records and what they sound like there. And this is something else I'm going to add. Sometimes on modern music production, it's not just about single band compression. It can be about multi-band compression. There's a lot of great compressors for doing multi-band compression. I used to use the Wave C4 a bunch back in my mixing days. These days, I like to use a little bit of the Fab Filter. Pro MB is another great, easy one to use. DSP makes a great, easy to use one. Plug-in Alliance has them. Isotope has them. Multi-band compression can be an approach here, where sometimes you want to control areas that are only really boomy or murky on some notes and not all the time. You might have a singer who kind of moves around on the microphone, and their tone can change from note to note depending on how far they are, how on axis they are, how off axis they are. It can change depending on like where they recorded in a very small, not well treated closetty room that's amplifying certain low and low mid frequencies more than others, so only some notes jump out. Sometimes a little bit of multiband compression or a dynamic EQ in those problem areas can tuck them so they're not tucked, overall. So you're not just carving out 100 or 200 or 300 hertz all the time, making the vocal sound a little thin and hollow, but you're just tucking it when those areas become excessive. So if you go in there, start scooping out those areas and you're finding it's making your vocals too hollow, too thin, give that idea a try of using multiband compression or dynamic EQ in those same regions. All right, the next one that I'm going to mention, moving on to number 5, and this is one of the most important ones, what I consider overly cloying reverbs and delays, time-based effects in general. What do I mean by cloying? What does that word mean? It means overly sweet, like overly saccharine kind of sweetness. Like if you've ever had a dessert wine that's just too sweet and makes you go, ew, what's that? Why is it so syrupy? Why do I feel like I'm drinking like a cross between maple syrup that's been vinegarized but tastes like artificial cherry or something? What's going on here? That cloying sweetness of a reverb that makes itself too known, and too known in the wrong areas. Because let me tell you, if you've ever had a really good dessert wine, I'm talking about like a Tawny Porto here. I'm talking about a glass of port, maybe Dow's or Croft that's been aged 30 or 40 years. Mwah! Chef's kiss over here. Those things are not cloyingly sweet. They're thick, they're full, they're dark, they're robust, they have personality. You can smell and taste like tobacco in them and like shoe leather, but in a good way, that kind of thing. And that's what you want out of your reverbs. And the biggest problem with reverbs are they're too long, they're too wet, and they're too bright. And the too bright one usually being the very big one, that you're just not taking enough high frequency off of things like reverbs and delays. I want you to really think about softening high frequencies on your reverbs. One of the most amateurish things I hear on any records is someone who takes an impressive sounding reverb plugin And they're like, wow, that's really impressive and big and bright sounding. What a great sounding reverb. Let me just use that. And they use some stock impressive sounding reverb, and it washes all over the whole mix, and it doesn't work. Because that's not what your favorite producers, mixers, engineers, artists are doing. What they're usually doing is taking a reverb and trying to give it an accent that fits the track, taking off lots of high frequency off reverbs. You do not need 20K in your reverb. You do not need 15K. You probably don't need 10K. You might not even need 8K. And I'm looking very suspiciously, depending on the record, at 6K and 7K. You might start rolling off top end on your reverb around 5K. That's possible. Think about rolling off, not at 15K, but somewhere between 5K and 10K. And I'm going to tell you to err on the side of rolling off lower than you think you should. Start there and see if it doesn't sound better. You can always slide it out and bring more top end back in if you need it. Now, once you're doing that, you probably also want to take out excessive amounts of 100 hertz, 200, 300 hertz, etc. But almost all of your favorite reverbs are surprisingly mid-rangey sounding reverbs if you really analyze them. There's some exceptions here where reverbs will be accented towards the highs, but still it's usually not a ton of 12K and 15K and 20K. So there are bright sounding reverbs out there that will tend to have very little low frequency content, but very bright sounding reverbs that are used effectively sometimes are followed up with things like de-essing the reverb return or really fast attack compression on the reverb return when they're voiced brighter, and they usually don't have a ton of like 18 and 20K in them. And in addition to that, to get away with shorter reverbs and still make them sound impressive and keep them from making the vocal sound drowned out and farther away than everything else in the mix, adding pre-delay to them is useful. And not just pre-delay, but enough pre-delay to matter. Because when you're doing 5 milliseconds of pre-delay, 10 milliseconds of pre-delay, 20 milliseconds of pre-delay, 30 milliseconds of pre-delay, ain't nobody can hear that. And I don't mean like, oh, I have golden ears, so I can hear 30 milliseconds of pre-delay. No, there is a psychoacoustic phenomenon that affects all human beings. It's called the Haas effect. It means that if two sounds arrive at your ear and the difference between them is less than 40 or 50 milliseconds, they sound to you like one sound. A reverb really starts to separate from the vocal once the pre-delay gets longer than 40 or 50 milliseconds. And that's where the pre-delays really start to matter. Delayed reverb. Now, some engineers say, I don't really use pre-delay. But the misleading thing about some of the great mix engineers who've told me I don't really use pre-delay, what they do instead is they actually don't use a lot of reverb in general. What they use more is delays, and then they send their delays to reverbs. And guess what's happening there? They've just used a pre-delay. And maybe some of these engineers, they say, oh, I don't really mess around with the reverb returns. Instead, what they have is delays where they've really messed around with the delay, and they're making sure that's like a tape-like delay where a lot of the high frequencies are rolled off, and now they're sending their vocal into a delay, and then that delay is what feeds their reverbs. So when you hear someone say, I don't really mess around with pre-delay, or I don't really mess around with the reverb return EQs, it's like, okay, well, are you using delay? And are you messing around with how bright that delay is? And are you feeding your delays to reverbs? Because then the answer is probably, oh yeah. And that's how they're doing the same exact thing that I just described. So think about using delays instead of reverbs, and then maybe reverbing your delays. So these are some of the ways to get less cloying reverbs. And one of the other great byproducts here is you don't want to add reverb to a vocal and have the vocal like sink back in the mix and now be further away from you than the acoustic guitars and the electric guitars and the drum kit. Now the vocal's the furthest away thing in the mix. That's not what you wanted. You wanted the reverb not to add distance, but to add personality and intrigue and character. That's why you separate with pre-delay. Because imagine if I'm standing in front of you in a cathedral and I sing, what are you going to hear? You're going to first hear my dry voice hitting your ears, and then later you're going to hear the reverb of the entire space. That's the effect that you want to have. Now, on the other hand, imagine me being on the other side of the cathedral and I start singing. Now my original dry voice and all those reflections are reaching your ear about the same time, and I sound really far away. But if instead I'm standing right next to you, my voice is going to hit you, and then later the reverb will hit you. And that's how you're going to make it sound spacious and amazing and impressive without having the vocal sound distant and far away. I could go so much more into any of these topics. And I do in my courses like mixing breakthroughs, compression breakthroughs, EQ breakthroughs, mastering demystified. If you have liked this off the top of my head rant where like I've mispronounced some words and all this stuff, you know what? What you'd like even better is my fully scripted, fully planned out, chock full of audio examples courses. Mixing breakthroughs will change the way that you work forever for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. It is a full system for mixing. It's like having me as your virtual mix coach. And you get to see me mix in real time in front of you and allow you to hear some of these kinds of changes. But the most important thing that it does, even better than watching me mix, even more than the coaching, is some of the exercises we give you. Because the way that you really get better is practice, putting these ideas into action. And I want you to take some of the ideas from today's episode and put them into action in your own mixes right now. Instead of saying, why aren't there audio examples in your podcast episode? Instead of doing that, use those typing fingers. Instead of typing, yeah, you didn't put audio examples in your podcast episode, use the typing fingers to go, oh, I'm going to do stuff in my DAW now. I'm going to take these 5 ideas and mess around with them on a vocal right now, because that's what's going to make you better, not watching me mix. And if you want even better exercises than that, the courses are chock full of them. You want to hear compression like you've never heard it before? Check out Compression Breakthroughs. It'll change the way that you hear compression forever, for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. You really want to be able to instantly make good decisions about EQ, make better first guesses and better final decisions? Check out EQ Breakthroughs. You will hear the frequency spectrum like you never had before. Again, guaranteed, or your money back. You want to learn everything I know about mastering. As a platinum mastering engineer, check out Mastering Demystified. If you don't know where to start, I think Mixing Breakthroughs is a great place to start. If you buy them all together, it becomes a stupid deal. Go over to members.sonicscoop.com if you want to check out some of the rent-to-own options, where you can pay like a subscription for 1 year and then you own all of the courses at the end. It's an amazing deal. Go to members.sonicscoop.com for that, or just type in mixingbreakthroughs.com, eqbreakthroughs.com, compressionbreakthroughs.com. They're all down in the show notes and all of that stuff. Well, this has been a fun live stream. I also want to give a quick shout out and thanks to our sponsors, once again being Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. And if you've gotten this far, please hit like, subscribe, share this with one of your friends. That's a super supportive way to help this podcast and enjoy tons more free episodes and free videos we have on this channel. Some of them like this, some of them with audio examples. There's a whole bunch of stuff. And let me just real quick say hi to all the people who joined us for the live stream. Flip, Philip, David, Benj, Bernardo, Mary. Great to have you guys here. Paul is asking, is it better to use a high-pass filter or a shelf, maybe for the reverbs? The answer is either or both, depending on how much you want to get rid of. But generally, I'm recommending starting with high and low pass filters for cutting high frequencies and low frequencies out of things like reverbs and delays, because you probably want to cut a lot more than you think you do. And if you start using shelves, now you're shelving down 3 dB, like first make the big changes. And the big changes are going to come from your high and low pass filters. And then if you need to just shade it a little bit more in one direction or the other, I would use shelves second. Alex Christoph says, this channel saved my life. I was on the edge looking down. That's awesome to hear. Hope this was, glad this was useful for you. Damka says, in many courses, they proclaim the treatment of effects in general in a subtle way, because not even they know very well how to mix. You know, that may be true in some cases. There are a lot of people who teach who don't do. That said, there are some people who are great teachers who understand the stuff well and, you know, don't have the biggest careers because they focused more into teaching. And some of those people teach very well, but there's also a lot of charlatans who are repeating the same bad advice again and again. And it is good to check out who you're learning from. Hopefully when you check out me, I seem credible, but it's not just about how good the work that I do is. It's about whether or not these ideas that I'm giving you, whether if you put them into practice are going to improve what you do. And I've got to tell you, I've been coaching and doing courses now for more than a decade. And the before and afters that I see from people who actually take this advice and put it into practice, it's amazing the leapfrogs that people make by implementing this kind of advice. And I've got to tell you, every year, I figure out just a little bit better how to describe this stuff, or I notice a little bit more, some patterns of mistakes and improvements that people could make. And I don't know. The reason I'm so confident when I talk in these episodes about what you need to do is because I've seen the same problems again and again, and I've seen what really fixes them, and what really helps people go from where they were to where they really hope they would wind up being when it comes to music and audio production. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.